Not be live. Let me know in the comments if it's not working. But allow me to say hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Free. What the hell's going on here? God damn it. That's what I wanted. Am I here? Let's see. Okay. Sounds like we're here. Hello and welcome to live streaming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia and the fact that I believe it is a domestic United States issue, not an international relations issue. It is about corruption, first and foremost. I think the key point that I want to make today is that Biden is not bowing to Saudi pressure. He is bowing to pressure from people that Saudi Arabia bribed, domestic actors within the U.S. political system. So I think that's a crucial distinction that is worth making. Before we get started, just want to say welcome back. This is the first public live chat we've done in over a month. It's been a while. I may be rusty. I may be out of practice. But it's great to see you all here. In case you're new to this, some ground rules. I will do a presentation. I think it'll be briefer than normal. This time, followed by question and answer period. So while I'm doing the presentation, I do not have the mental bandwidth to pay attention to what's going on in the comments, and that is why we have Logo Cool Extreme, our moderator. You're allowed to talk about pretty much anything you want in the comments. You can say anything about me, my appearance, my choices, what have you. Certainly my arguments. What we do ask is that you not say anything, is that you not be disruptive of the chat and that you not be negative towards each other, that you not attack anyone else in the chat. Loga will enforce that with extreme prejudice. If you are being disruptive or excessively negative or attacking other people, Logo will warn you, and then if you do not change your behavior, then he will block you. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. Also, allow me to say that I am sort of severely under the weather, and I'm also hosting family members who are under the weather as well. So you may see folks walking around the background. I am less prepared for this presentation than I typically am. So I ask for your patience. And actually, this may be a shorter live chat than it has been typically, just because I'm pretty out of it and struggling, which you may already be noticing. The first thing, what motivated this particular live chat? The event in question is not an event. It's an event that's going to happen, but it's an event that was heavily, announced, essentially. What has happened is that now, about a year and a half into Joe Biden's presidential term, he is about to renounce one of his campaign promises, which was to hold Saudi Arabia at greater length, to treat Saudi Arabia as a pariah, I believe is language that was actually used in his campaign speeches. This is something that never really materialized. The United States has continued to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, has continued to support Saudi Arabia in its horrific war in Yemen, has continued to do almost all of the things that Saudi Arabia requires. It's just that we haven't been as gross and obsequious, is that a term? As humiliating to ourselves. We haven't abased ourselves before Saudi Arabia, our client state, our colony, during the Biden administration the way we did during the Trump administration. The Trump administration, now very widely rewarded, Jared Kushner and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, have famously gotten, I think, about $1 billion each in payouts from Saudi Arabia in return for how disgustingly Saudi serving the Trump administration was. The Biden administration continued almost all of those policies, but wasn't as openly ass-kissing to Saudi Arabia. That is now changing. It was made clear this week that Biden is supposedly relenting on this horrific treatment of Saudi Arabia. We'll be visiting Saudi Arabia in July, and we'll be meeting with Mr. Bonesaw, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, who both is the architect of the disaster in Yemen that has killed 400,000 people, and also, more importantly to Washington, D.C. elites, murdered Jamal Khashoggi, ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, I guess in 2018. So it's humiliating, is what it is. It's sad. It's quite disturbing that a U.S. president can't even maintain vague distance or distaste for the Saudi royal family that carried out the largest and most disturbing attack on the United States of the 21st century, 9/11. It's really quite extraordinarily humiliating. But maybe this is just a way to salve my conscience. Maybe this is a way to make myself feel a little bit better about this abject abasement, this sort of disgusting cowardice, and what's inappropriate. I lack the words. I don't like speaking in such elevated words about humiliation and disgust, but that's the only vocabulary I have to reach for when I consider what the Biden administration is doing here, wholly pointlessly. There is no reason for the Biden administration to go to Saudi Arabia and participate in the song and dance with this medieval monarchy that is completely dependent on us. It's pointless and stupid. But I think what I want to talk about today is why this is happening. I think there's an interpretation here that folks are bandying about, that Saudi Arabia has some kind of power in this relationship, has some kind of ability to coerce the United States into doing these things. Supposedly the importance of their large oil deposits, the potential to threaten the U.S.'s petrodollar status by threatening to start selling oil and gas in the Chinese renminbi rather than in the U.S. dollar. I think this is all mostly bullshit. The truth is, as I pointed out at the beginning, it's not that the United States is intimidated by Saudi Arabia. It is not that the United States or the Biden administration feels the need to curry favor with Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration feels the need to curry favor with people within the U.S. political system that Saudi Arabia has bought. It is bribery. It is corruption, pure and simple. And it is stuff that is so egregious that it's actually beginning to bring down legal consequences, even in the context of like the post-Reagan Department of Justice, where usually any level of foreign corruption is entirely acceptable. I think part of the reason that these activities are getting more scrutiny is that it's a really big part of Washington, D.C.'s argument against Russia, is that they somehow suborned or corrupted the U.S. system. And what was always funny about the Mueller investigation, the sort of the Russiagate more generally, was just how the mainstream national press, Democratic Party, the U.S. security state would just be going absolutely batshit about activities by the Russian government that were just regular practices, regular doing business on the part of the Israeli government, the Gulf governments, even like the British government. So I think as part of this crackdown for Russia propaganda purposes, just to have a basic sense of self-respect, the Department of Justice has had to prosecute some of the most egregious abuses by Gulf monarchies. The two cases that I feel like talking about right now, because they're the most egregious and I think most recent, don't actually involve Saudi Arabia. They involve different Gulf monarchies. Qatar has just roiled the Brookings Institution, which is the most I'd say the Brookings Institution, it'd be fair to call the Brookings Institution the most prestigious think tank in Washington, D.C. This is the nominally nonpartisan think tank it's interesting. I think in my conservative days, I used to be like, oh, it's BS that the Brookings Institution is nonpartisan, it's liberal or whatever. But no, it's actually, it's about power. The Brookings Institution is about serving power. It's about serving defense contractors. It's about serving, Washington, D.C.'s interests. Or theoretically, it's about serving Washington, D.C.'s interests. About 4 years back, there was a blockbuster New York Times report laying out just how much of the work of think tanks like Brookings and other think tanks was pay to play by Gulf monarchies. And now it's finally having some ramifications. There's this amazing quote in a finance podcast yesterday, I think from, is it Jim Chanos or something? It's a completely different realm, talking about short selling, and he sort of talks about how short sellers are detectives, but the U.S. government, the regulatory agents, are archaeologists. They will deal with issues long after the fact. So I think it's been 4 or 5 years since the New York Times sort of blew the whistle on how completely corrupt the entire Washington, D.C. think tank scene is, and how completely they're paid off by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And finally, this week, the U.S. Department of Justice opened an investigation against John Allen, the retired general that was in charge of the Brookings Institution, and he has resigned in disgrace, finally. Not that means there's been any real shift here. The other case, he was basically, he is being investigated for acting as a straight-out, unacknowledged representative of the Qatari government. Tom Barrack, the head of the Donald Trump inauguration committee, is probably the most high-profile person to be taken out. I guess that would be Paul Manafort, of course. But Tom Barrack worked closely with Paul Manafort to sell the Trump administration to the United Arab Emirates. Qatari influence is kind of interesting because when MBS came to power in Saudi Arabia and the UAE teamed up against Qatar. So there have been periods when Qatari interests have been very much in line with Saudi Arabia and UAE, but throughout the Trump administration, that was not the case. It's debatable that the Qataris may now be more aligned with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but in general, I think they all sort of serve to illustrate this just absurd status quo in Washington, D.C., where a bunch of medieval monarchies, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all fit under that moniker, are purchasing the political figures and the policy choices of what's nominally one of the world's first and largest democracies, the United States. It's just really grim. So the reason I wanted to highlight John Allen and Tom Barrack is that they're sort of flip sides of the same coin, of a different coin. Wait, okay, I've completely lost track of that metaphor. But what's interesting about them is that they represent such nominally different parts of the Washington, D.C. community. I mean, John Allen is a retired general in charge of the Brookings Institution. I mean, you can't imagine a guy who would be more whole hog for the sort of Clinton Democratic anti-Russia crusade against the Trump administration. I don't know this for a fact. I haven't researched John Allen that much as a figure, but I would imagine that if there were any letters to be signed against Trump and Russia and this, that, and the other thing, or opportunities to be a talking head against Trump and Russia, I would assume John Allen would be leading the charge on that. And now Tom Barrack is a corrupt businessman working for the Trump administration, heading the Trump administration's inauguration committee. So nominally, these are different factions within Washington, D.C. These are, if you watch cable news, these are the biggest enemies imaginable. You've got the basically sort of Democrat establishmentarian versus the Trumpy businessman. This is the wide range of U.S. politics that cable news imagines, and they're both completely have their hands stuck out. Their hands in the till when it comes to Saudi Arabia. They are being bribed by Saudi Arabia quite straightforwardly, and quite quite happily. They're enjoying it thoroughly. And yeah, so there is no real political division when it comes to Saudi money. Everybody in Washington, D.C. loves it. I should point out now that it's just not, it's amazing how much this acquiescence to Saudi Arabia, this getting back on the filleting Saudi Arabia train thing is not about oil. The Saudis have agreed, I believe, with Russia, don't quote me on that, I should have investigated this in detail, but have agreed to up their production by about 250,000 barrels a day. That is nothing. And the Saudis are continuing their relationship. They have, I think, since the fall of 2016, they have had a direct relationship, a cartel relationship with Russia to limit the amount of oil production in the world. What's extraordinary about this incredible gift that the Saudis have given to the Biden administration in return for this abject humiliation is that it's not abandoning the relationship with Russia. It's not opening the taps. It is an agreed minor increase in oil production in the context of the ongoing OPEC plus agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia. We had, in the aftermath of Biden's really humiliating concession this week that he's going to go meet MBS and kiss his ass, you had Saudi officials saying, well, the relationship with Russia couldn't be any better. And this 250,000 barrels a day is nothing compared to the potential rise in production that the United States could get from the JCPOA. Honestly, this Biden outreach to Saudi Arabia, getting closer with Saudi Arabia, isn't even bad for Russia. Might actually serve Russia's interests if, you know, Russia concedes this 250,000 barrel a day increase in return for Saudi Arabia continuing to make it impossible for the United States to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. And so basically Russia is giving, you know, allowing 250,000 more barrels a day to come onto the market in return for blocking over 1 million barrels a day from the Iranian market. I was seeing on Twitter this morning, credible analysts that I trust, estimating that getting back into the JCPOA would instantly knock down the price of a barrel of oil by $10. It would have huge positive impacts. Something that the Biden administration tried to do and chickened out on doing because of Florida politics, nightmarishly bad politicians for the U.S. interests like Democrat Bob Menendez, Republicans Tom Cotton and Marco Rubio. The Biden administration attempted to reopen diplomatic conversations with Maduro of Venezuela. It would take a lot more time to get the Venezuelan oil industry up and running, but we're not actually dealing with a short-term issue here. Oil and gas production in Russia is going to be disrupted for months and years to come, so it makes sense to reopen with Venezuela. It would make sense for the Biden administration to exert itself in Libya to get production back online, something that the United States very much has power to do. The Biden administration has not chosen to do any of these things. What the opening to Saudi Arabia for absolutely nothing in return in terms of real movement against Russia, real movement towards massively more oil production from Saudi Arabia, in return for absolutely nothing. This is just a domestic political thing. This isn't Biden doing intelligent things in relation to the new geopolitical nightmare that we're dealing with the Russian war on Ukraine. No, this is just Washington, D.C. finally wearing the president down and forcing him to give up giving up his wildly popular and correct position on Saudi Arabia. It's really quite grim. Why do the Saudis have this power? I've mentioned in the past, I don't think I have to really recapitulate for anybody who's showing up for this just how much power Saudi Arabia has over the U.S. defense industry. Well, interestingly, in these months, Over the past 4 months, Saudi Arabia's power over the U.S. defense industry has plummeted, actually, um, which makes me believe there's a certain amount of inertia in Washington, D.C., a certain amount of. It's interesting. It's almost like the defense industry is missing this extraordinary opportunity in Russia and Ukraine in order to compete for the piddling income streams of missiles in Yemen. That's actually, sorry, I'm digressing a bit, but I think that's something to think a little harder about. But more generally, and certainly as of today, funding relationships don't change that quickly. Political positions that politicians in Washington, D.C. do not change in reaction to world events that quickly. And the U.S. defense industry is still very much in the service of Saudi Arabia. Not just because they like selling weapons in Yemen, not just because Saudi Arabia buys everything that they can from the United States, but also because those funding relationships are now directly intertwined. Saudis and Raytheon executives mix and mingle all over the place in Washington, D.C., at the fundraising dinners for all of the defense-oriented think tanks. The main distinction between think tanks in Washington, D.C. at this point is, foreign policy-focused think tanks in Washington, D.C. at this point are they entirely funded by Gulf interests or just partially funded by Gulf interests? It's very hard to find a serious, impactful Washington, D.C. think tank that isn't funded by the Gulf to some degree. So sort of the top funders for Washington, D.C. think tanks are the defense industry and the Gulf monarchies directly. I think it's a story we're all familiar with. Incredible Saudi power over the defense industry. And a new wrinkle that MBS has introduced that I was more dubious of and thought was going to be a failure, and I was wrong about, is I think I've got a video up on it on YouTube talking about how Saudi Arabia is Wall Street at this point, was that Saudi Arabia put tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars over the past 5 years, has taken that money and dumped it not into developing Saudi Arabia, but in further inflating a tech bubble in the public and private markets in the United States. So Saudi Arabia has not just turned the U.S. defense industry into one of its most solid allies, it has also turned serious sectors of the U.S. financial industry into its biggest supporters. And the defense industry is interesting. I've talked about this in the past. It's actually not that large a facet of the U.S. economy. It's something akin to 5 to 10%. But they do have a really special relationship with government because the defense industry is a fundamentally socialist or even communist industry. It is completely controlled by the government. It's completely controlled by the Congress people. Any other business, you can have a factory in your district from the bathtub business, but then maybe somebody makes a better bathtub and that factory goes away. Congress people love defense and aerospace, also NASA as well, because they are in control of whether or not that factory survives. It's a fundamentally communist sort of command and control industry. So even though it's a small part of the U.S. economy, every congressperson, 98% of congresspeople, work hand in glove with the defense industry. Finance and tech and the sort of unholy marriage that they've engaged in over the past decade are the biggest part, together, are the lion's share of the U.S. economy. So what Saudi Arabia has done very savvily over the past 10 years, what MBS I think specifically has done, has taken a situation where, they had U.S. oil companies are very influential and I think generally kind of disliked Saudi Arabia, the competition, and defense companies that always loved Saudi Arabia, and has just completely blown up that conversation by getting the biggest sectors in the country on their side. Finance by just the sheer volume of flows of investment that Saudi Arabia has pumped into the U.S. economy over the MBS period. And tech, because this whole, I mean, there are other factors, the Federal Reserve interest rates, of course, but the sheer mind-blowing scale of the tech bubble over the past 10 years has been, in large part, a Saudi production. The most famous implementation of that would probably be SoftBank, is it my associate son's Vision Fund, which I think between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think Saudi Arabia directly gave the $100 billion Vision Fund $45 billion. I think the UAE was good for at least another 10. So yeah, just a fund of $100 billion dumped into hiding the ball from the U.S. public and the U.S. investor, continuing this pretense that companies that have never made money, like Uber or Lyft, or even to some degree, though I think it's more of a remove, cryptocurrency. I'd be surprised if the Saudis were stupid enough to be big crypto investors, but one never knows. I think a lot of Saudi's survival over the past decade has been not about meaningful rejuvenation or diversification of the Saudi economy, but a diversification of Saudi bribery in the United States. It's debatable. I was reading up this morning, how is SoftBank doing? What's fascinating about this whole tech bubble is there's the question of when did people take their money out? So if the Saudis were savvy, if they timed things appropriately, if they were, in the organizing syndicates of all these SPACs, if they were smart enough to sell significant chunks of their investments before the music stopped, which the music has definitely been stopping over the past couple months, then maybe they profited from all this. But I think it's much more likely that the Saudis have gotten burned pretty heavily, which is not good for Saudi Arabia, MBS, or what have you. But they are back in a context of very high oil prices thanks to Russia. So it's almost Saudi Arabia is an American colony, and they're also almost benefiting from the old supposedly Bismarckian quote about God loves fools, drunks in the United States. Well, it appears that God loves fools, drunks in the United States and Saudi Arabia. Just as their big tech play was exploding, Russia decided to send the worldwide oil market through the roof. Okay, so there's that. I said that. Gosh, it's been about a half hour, and I think that may be most of what I had to say. No, I'm sorry. One other thing that MBS has been doing, I think, did not find anything to support this, but this is my sense, and I could be entirely wrong about this, and let me know in the comments if you think so, but I think I've seen, especially in the aftermath of like the first 3 or 4 years of the Arab Spring, when Saudi spending was extraordinary on sort of regional and domestic issues, I think we've seen a lot of real streamlining of Saudi efforts away from this, we're going to radicalize the whole world, we're going to turn the Wahhabi, the whole world Wahhabi. I think that they've reached a point where a lot of a lot of countries outside of the Arab world, a lot of Middle Eastern countries have now attained enough of their own wealth that Saudi radicalization money just isn't as effective as it once was. And there's definitely, so I'm not entirely certain that Saudi funding for radicalization abroad has fallen. Certainly MBS's rhetoric has changed. Certainly, and this is real, there has been a real undercutting of the influence of radicals within Saudi Arabia. So that's been streamlined. I think there's more money streamed away from those kinds of efforts and into the kinds of efforts that are bearing fruit this week, which is just sending the money directly back to the patron, just bribing the boss, bribing the United States. And there's no question in my mind that that has happened with Saudi investment funds. There's this figure, Prince Talawid or something like that. I believe he's a grandson of the founder of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, but I don't think he's from a particularly favored branch or line. He's a member of the Saudi royal family, and he was the famous face of Saudi investing for at least 2 or 3 decades. He had had a famous famous controversy back in 2001, I believe, when he made a big donation after the 9/11 attacks, and then sort of lectured Giuliani on how 9/11 had happened because U.S. Supports Israel against Palestine. It was a very different world back then. And Rudy Giuliani sort of angrily returned the gift or something like that. But regardless, since the 1990s, this guy Talawid, Prince Talawid, I don't know, was sort of the famous face of Saudi investing and very rich himself, and this, that, and the other thing. And he got swept up in MBS's initial purges back in 2017 when he arrested half of the richest businessmen in Saudi Arabia and richest members of the royal family and locked them all up in the Ritz-Carlton until they agreed to essentially cut the government in on all of the business dealings that they were doing. So I think there's been, while in the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, Saudi Arabia's focus was a little more diffuse. They were radicalizing everywhere. I think it's entirely fair to say the Saudi royal family is responsible for 9/11. There's enough evidence that indicates that, and of course the U.S. government did everything it possibly could to avoid evidence that indicated that. But I think you could make an argument that that's a little unfair because it was just one set of elements within the Saudi royal family that did this. It's not like, I guess, Crown Prince Abdullah at the time, was it King Fahd, was already incapacitated in 2001. It's not like Crown Prince Abdullah was like, yeah, let's fucking do 9/11. No. It was some weird faction within the Saudi royal family, because the Saudi royal family used to be something with more factions. Since then, since MBS, there's been a great deal of streamlining. It has become more authoritarian in a lot of ways. It's become more consolidated. And this streamline, the main priority of the Saudi government and foreign policy now is buttering up the United States, is pouring money into bribing the United States. And I think that's why all that money, all those figures that have been purchased, all those businessmen, all those congresspeople have finally borne fruit. This is why I think it's particularly ridiculous, the coverage that talks about how, oh yeah, Saudi Arabia is going to abandon the United States for Russia and China. It's nonsense. The kingdom has literally poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the U.S. market over the past 5 years. The $45 billion to SoftBank. There's a public investment fund, I believe, is actually the entity that owns the SoftBank shares, the Vision Fund shares. I'm not entirely certain about that. But there's just all these other, Talawid, who is now very chastened, and recently, the most recent bit of news was he sort of sold at a bargain price 15% of his investment fund to the Saudi government. This was a recent revelation. That's another big pool of money that is mostly poured into U.S. financial markets. We all remember the Elon Musk Twitter thing. Supposedly goes day by day whether or not that's actually happening. But Twitter's here in New York City, actually. What was I going to say? The Kingdom Investments, Talawid, this is completely distinct from the Vision Fund, the My Association thing, has a $1.5 billion stake in that absurdly high $42 billion Twitter price. So yeah, they're just sort of everywhere, but streamlined in that the demands are less about making money than they are about bribing the United States and getting what they want out of the United States. I feel like I wanted to do more with this, but it has been a very spectacularly unproductive morning. I've been sort of out of it. I guess it's time for question and answers. And we'll do this. I think I can do an hour of this. I'm not certain I'm going to make it to the full 2 hours, 2 hour mark. But great to see you all here. Do we have questions? What are we talking about? Loga is pitching Patreon, which is a very good thing. Everybody should sign up on Patreon. That is fun for me. That is how this channel continues to survive and exist, is people setting up on Patreon. Do we have questions? Questions. Did I miss any super chats? Super chats, of course, make me more likely to let's see. The Wall Street Journal posted a reinstating the Senussi dynasty in Libya article. That's pretty extraordinary. I mean, it is a good point, and I think kind of worth, it's a positive thing about the United States. It is interesting, like it is a marketplace. It is a marketplace of ideas. We do still have institutions that will publish batshit nonsense. The Wall Street Journal, as Fadil's pointing out in the comments, ran a op-ed saying that Libya's dictatorship from the 1950s, monarchy from the 1950s, should be restored. I think, to be clear, I think they were just advocating for the post-independence constitution, which was a monarchy. And yeah, it's, these views show up in these newspapers largely because somebody paid for them. And that is, negative in some ways, but it also is just kind of hilarious that figures with such little power and relevance as the half-century displaced monarchs of Libya can still try to, buy their way back through U.S. newspapers. That's maybe not something I feel so positive about. What I do feel positive about is what I talked about at the beginning, where the Department of Justice can, what's the word I'm looking for? The U.S. Department of Justice still has enough self-respect to go after corrupt political figures that the Gulfies have purchased. And that's a good thing. I mean, the reason that we know so much about the Gulf monarchy's purchase of Washington, D.C. is because of the New York Times and the Department of Justice. There's still some institutional strength left in the United States. We should, after sort of 40 years of Reagan defunding and handing everything off to the Fortune 500, we should be grateful for that and see what we can do to bring more of it back. Local Extreme asks, what are your thoughts on the Fed raising interest rates, and how will this affect China? I think it's incredibly grim that the U.S. Federal Reserve is currently actively killing the economic recovery in the United States, because that's what they're doing. I mean, make no bones about it. They'll be a little more subtle about it, but if you watch the Jerome Powell press conferences, the chair of the Fed, he'll talk about we're seeing the labor market slow down. We're seeing seeing these things slow down and break. That's the goal of raising the interest rates. Tamping down U.S. economic growth is the goal. Now, I'm not as uncritical, so I'm not a huge critic of the Federal Reserve, because what Powell and Bernanke, I guess was Ben Bernanke and Yellen, the situation that they had to deal with in opposite directions is a U.S. Congress and a U.S. government that isn't willing to do basic stuff that they should have been doing. I talked the second Russia went into Ukraine, I started talking about how desperately important it was that the U.S. got back to a position of peace or opened back up to Iran and Venezuela, because it was clear to anybody what would happen to the oil market in the context of war between Russia and Ukraine. We got this incredible 3-month reprieve because of Chinese shutdowns for COVID. So that actually cut demand dramatically just as the war was starting. So we didn't hit $150 for a barrel of oil in March as I expected because of those shutdowns. But now, 4 months later, the steady march up is continuing as China begins to reopen. And that is a real fucking problem. And, I'm a little out of it. The point that I was making is that the Federal Reserve has absolutely acted in ways that are unhelpful, are unwise, and excessive. Talking about quantitative easing was a bad idea, and this really massive interest rate hikes at this point are also a bad idea. But the question is, what else do you expect the Federal Reserve to do? Because I respect the Federal Reserve because they are willing to take actions to improve things. During the Obama administration, with the mostly hostile Republican Congress that he had after 2010, I think after 2010, Obama always had a Republican Congress. They refused to do anything to try to get the U.S. economy going again after the great financial crisis. There was a stimulus in 2008, 2009. I think bailed out car companies, and then after 2010, there was absolutely nothing. As in, the history's mildest recovery kept limping on. And the Fed, Ben Bernanke, not a rampaging communist, wasn't he more or less like hyper-libertarian, Ayn Randian, Alan Greenspan's more or less chosen successor? Bernanke, a very conservative economist, pointed out that if Congress wasn't going to spend the money necessary to get the U.S. economy going again, he would, and he did, and it was successful. We've now got a context where there were a large range of decisions that the Biden administration could have made to lessen supply chain problems. You've got Mayor Pete Buttigieg at the Department of Transportation doing essentially nothing to alleviate this insane supply chain crisis. You've got Biden being too cowardly to take simple steps against rising oil prices, like in Libya, in Venezuela, in Iran. So if the Congress and the executive refuse to do things that alleviate problems in the economy and allowed us to fall into an inflationary cycle, then the Fed has got to do what it's got to do. Can I speak with an expert's eye towards whether the right amount of interest rate hikes are being done or the right amount of tapering is being done in terms of asset purchases? Hell no, I can't speak to that at all. But I am sympathetic to the Federal Reserve, which has been for the past decade acting as sort of the only adults in the room. Specifically, I was very impressed with Jerome Powell during the COVID crisis and just the willingness, the eagerness with which he just backstopped the entire world financial system. It was this very strange thing where the entire world was appalled and disgusted by the lack of leadership from Donald Trump on COVID, but was still entirely reliant on the United States because of the leadership of Jerome Powell. I think a lot of folks would argue that he acted too late. I'm sorry, my TikTok, I'm going to have to say goodbye on TikTok. You guys can still watch this live on YouTube, though. My phone is heating up, so I have to let that go. Sorry, folks. Don't want to burn down my phone. So ending the live on TikTok. I'm now just here on YouTube. So yeah, I mean it's interesting. The Federal Reserve is very interesting. I keep meaning to read up on the history of it more. I've read a lot of potted history over the past year, talking about how basically we had crypto, we had the situation where we had private currencies prior to the Federal Reserve, and it was a fucking disaster. I think the Federal Reserve is incredibly maligned because it has so much power. So I should probably learn more about it. And I've got a little pile of books on the Federal Reserve, just like I've got a little pile of books on Sudan. I've got a little pile of books that need to be read through. But the Federal Reserve is a fascinating institution that I think a lot of people have. Unfortunately, I would say that the most prevalent scholars of the Federal Reserve are folks pushing like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. I've actually, one of the books that I've got is a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Oh, don't you understand? It's a private bank owned by Jacob Schiff and the Rothschilds or whatever. One of these years I'm going to do a deep dive on what the Federal Reserve is. But so yeah, like the actual specifics, I think a lot of people argue that Jerome Powell took too long to raise interest rates and allowed inflation to get out of hand. I don't know if that's true or not, but the Federal Reserve, it's an important institution. As far as the effects on China, basically when the U.S. economy slows down, so does the Chinese economy. That's so that works, because the rumors of the demise of Chimerica have been exaggerated. The famous China and America, Chimerica. Economically speaking, despite the tariffs that exist, despite trade war and agonizing over Taiwan, that's still the situation economically. So if Jerome Powell is successful in creating a recession in the United States, there will be an impact on China as well. Though we are in this extraordinary, I just haven't, I ran a video, I don't know, was it 3 months ago? Was it 6 months ago? I don't know, talking about how the Chinese economy's growth miracle was largely over. But man, it's just extraordinary how this year, even with the recession that will be induced, it looks likely, thanks to the shutdowns, that for the first year since the 1970s, the U.S. economy will grow more quickly than the Chinese economy, which is honestly just crazy to me, but I think is the case. Christopher Murtaugh, thank you for the super chat. In Republic Lost, Lawrence Lessig claims that nothing will get fixed in D.C. until citizen-funded elections are in place and corruption is addressed. He's sounding more right every day. Well, what's interesting about that interpretation about money, corporate money, this, that, and the other thing, was that in the Trump elections, maybe this doesn't disprove anything, but it's been kind of fascinating because the assumption since Citizens United would be that, the Republicans always have so much more money and, their corporations, but actually, Trump had less money in both of his elections than the Democrats did. And I think Bernie don't quote me on this, but Bernie did spectacularly well in fundraising, all off of individual donors. So I think that the salience of campaign finance as an issue has faded a little bit as folks at the New York Times and the Washington Post have realized that, oh, wait a second, fundraising is actually working better for the Democrats now than it is for the Republicans. I've been traditionally very anti-campaign finance laws. just because of how they always work in practice, which is they work to. It's actually very similar to my view of like how the disinformation stuff has worked. It always, whenever these things are legislated, or not even legislated, just affect the policies of corporations or this, that, and the other thing, they always function in a way to shut out the little guy, making it more difficult for the little guy to have a voice, while the bigger players figure out their way around the regulations. That's the way every piece of campaign finance reform has worked in the United States. Now, does that mean that campaign finance reform is impossible? I'm very conscious that that's an argument that I've believed in fervently, since before my libertarian days. Right? I mean, I've just that just seemed very straightforward, common sense to me. It worked very well with my libertarian politics in my 20s. So I just haven't really. I've never read Lawrence Lessig's book, despite meaning to for a decade or two, about campaign finance. I've never actually. So maybe I don't know, Christopher. Maybe I'd need to read the book. Maybe my suspicion of campaign finance laws is actually is something else that I'll discard in the age past Trump. But I honestly just haven't thought about it much. In a decade or so, there've just been other things that have taken my attention. Thanks for reminding me. I mean, I want to say in the aughts, Lawrence Lessig's writing on campaign finance reform was tremendously influential. The fact that John McCain was a big pusher of campaign finance reform, his main causes are like campaign finance reform and bombing Iran. I've just never been much of a fan of John McCain, so maybe that's also influence. But yeah, in the 2000s, Lawrence Lessig, campaign finance reform, McCain-Feingold, these were huge, very salient issues in Washington D.C. that I think have faded a little bit, perhaps unwisely. Dexonman asks, what political or economic changes can we expect if Republicans take the House or Senate or both? My expectation is fucking nothing other than impeachment proceedings against Joe Biden, racist campaigns against progressive congresswomen of color. I'd expect like Ilhan Omar, possibly the only good foreign policy. Barbara Lee's there too. The only good foreign policy congressperson will probably be stripped of her committee position on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Just bigotry. I think in the Republican mind, Steve, what was his name? Steve King, the somewhat openly racist Iowa congressman, was stripped of all his committee stuff, stripped of his positioning within Congress for being a bigot. So I think the Republicans are going to think, turnabout's fair play. So they're going to start going. You probably can't go after AOC to quite that same level because she's such a legitimately popular and compelling person. But absolutely expect in a Republican. So yeah, basically in a Republican Congress, I think the main thing you should expect are pogroms against congresswomen of color and the impeachment of Joe Biden. There are elements within the Republican Party that say things that are interesting and true. Interesting and true about forever wars that need to be ended, about concern about the military-industrial complex. It was always dubious or debatable how serious any of Republicans were about that. In the context of Russia and Ukraine, I think that's pretty much over anyway. I don't think you're going to see any. I think we're back, even as the economic consequences become infinitely worse than the whole 9/11, post 9/11 shit show. I would expect, at least for the next couple of years, I would expect the military-industrial complex to get no pushback from anybody in the Republican Party. And as I said, what they're going to do. The first thing they're going to do when they get power is attack and attempt to depower Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, of some of the few real critics of the military-industrial complex. There also are elements of the Republican Party that are talking more seriously about stuff that I've latterly become more interested in. Things about like antitrust, rolling back some of the libertarian excesses of the past 40 years. They're just talking a game, and they're talking a good game, and these are minor figures with no real power in the Republican establishment. So yeah, I would expect nothing positive from Republicans that have control of the Congress. I would expect a lot of grandstanding and some racist vendettas against women of color in the U.S. Congress. That's mostly what you can expect. And if there's anything positive or any kind of like legislative achievements that come out of a Republican Congress that I now think we're very likely to get, I'll eat my words and be very surprised, but I don't see it happening. See here, question up. There's a new super chat. Adam of Good. Have you ever read Peter Zeihan's books? He just released a new one, or seen any of his presentations? If so, your thoughts on his takes? Well, thank you, Adam of Good, for that super chat. And it's nice to have a question that I can immediately answer. There's a video. It was probably made it a year ago at this point. There's a video that was actually just a clip from one of these live presentations where I gave my full critique of Peter Zeihan. I really enjoy Peter Zeihan. I think that he's very compelling and snarky and makes good geopolitical content. I think that he is certainly a better listen and more right about things than, you know, what you'd read in the standard stuff from the Council on Foreign Relations or CNN or New York Times or Washington, D.C. Sorry, Washington Post. But I also think he gets some really important things wrong. And if you search out that video, I think you should find it. If you just say Mo Freedom Foundation, Peter Zeihan. Actually, no, it's on my homepage on the YouTube channel. I definitely included that in the YouTube drama playlist that's on the top of the homepage. So yeah, my take on Peter Zeihan is there. And after I made that video, actually, embarrassingly, I did finally go read one of Zeihan's books. I think it was here. It was The Accidental Superpower. I read the first of his books. And I have an in-depth, The Accidental Superpower. I have an in-depth review that I believe I left. I think I've got it in a linked comment or in the description on that Zeihan video, sort of my in-depth review. And yeah, he just quickly critique of Zeihan. I think he's entirely, he's much more on point talking about China than anybody in Washington, D.C. The fact that they're actually not, you know, the big threat is to China, not China against us. They are incredibly reliant on the United States. I think he goes too far with China and a whole number of other folks in saying that, oh, without the U.S. security envelope, these places aren't just going to have a hard time. They're completely unviable. I think he believes that China's going to split up, that China's going to fall apart economically and actually go back to a warring states period. I don't believe that at all. I think that's excessive. I think he's right. He's more right than everybody in Washington, D.C. I think Zeihan's in Colorado, right? On how little of a threat China is to the United States. But I think he goes too far. I think a lot of that is he just doesn't, he has a level of contempt for people outside of the United States. And I don't think it's racist. I think it's just arrogance. And I think it's a lack of understanding of history. I think that in almost every podcast you listen to him, he'll go on this spiel about how you have to understand that before World War II and this big deal that the United States made to fight the Soviets, it was all anarchy and it was empires fighting each other. And that certainly describes the period from 1914 to 1945, but that does not describe the entire 19th century. It, in fact, does not describe much of the human experience at all post-industrialization. Post-industrialization, I don't know if first, second, third, fourth industrial revolutions, I've never really enjoyed those divisions much. But after the British industrialized, they were in charge of the world, and they screwed it up. And I would argue that Zion doesn't just misunderstand the history of geopolitics in the period before the United States and after industrialization. I'd say he actively misrepresents it. I was actually very disappointed by the accidental superpower. Just like his description of the Bretton Woods system was inaccurate. He basically described free trade as being the Bretton Woods system. That's not true. The Bretton Woods system is a currency regulation that existed from the end of World War II until Nixon, 1971, 1972. It is not a system that currently exists. It's not like, it is confusing. People do refer to the IMF and the World Bank as the Bretton Woods institutions, but they found different roles in the post-Bretton Woods era. So yeah, I think Zion is tremendously valuable. I enjoy his work. I think I probably will. I may actually end up purchasing and reviewing his new book. That might be a good YouTube drama thing. But yeah, I think he gets some important things wrong, as I would no doubt assume he would say I get important things wrong, or everything, who knows. It's an interesting question. Have there been any, Angel Balanzar asks, has there been any historical figures in the United States similar to Marjorie Taylor Greene? Specifically, I mean, I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene in her particular, I don't know. You could sort of argue that, Marjorie Taylor Greene, to be able to be that batshit crazy in the Congress and be a woman is kind of a feminist victory. But we have certainly had batshit crazy people in the Congress before. Was there like a certain level of dignity in the Congress in earlier centuries? Probably not. I mean, famously, who was there was a Republican congressman who was beaten nearly to death on the Congress floor. I think that 100% the sort of the post-Trump wave of completely inappropriate congressional representatives, sort of Madison Cawthorn, who is no longer with us. I mean, he's alive, but he lost a primary. Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene are probably the most famously out there. But yes, I would say in the long history of the U.S. Congress, there have been plenty of huge crackpots. And as far as, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's like, it's funny. Just popped into my head. Can't imagine more different people in physical representation, relationship to Christianity, seriousness of beliefs and dedication. But there's something of the Carrie Nation around Marjorie Taylor Greene. Carrie Nation was, of course, nowhere near the Congress. I don't believe women were allowed to run for the Congress at that period of time. But she was a tremendously influential woman in the 19th century, maybe into the 20th, in the temperance movement. And she would famously go around the country with her hatchet and break into and destroy saloons and bars. Is a big advocate for prohibition. So yeah, I mean, like the United States, I think during the Cold War, the United States experienced a weirdly unified and cohesive political scene. So I think the degree of craziness that we've seen with Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and other folks like that is honestly more of a return to form than it is to. And it's not even just a right-wing thing. I mean, you can argue like there's figures like Cynthia McKinney. What's the name of the woman who eventually lost her seat? There's a woman from California. Is famous for beating up Michael Tracy. This is an 80-year-old African-American congresswoman, I believe from California somewhere, who's famous for beating up the 20-something Russia hoax journalist Michael Tracy, which is kind of funny. But yeah, that's a Twitter beef that may not be amusing to folks. Sorry. Oh, that's an easy and fun question. Fadl asks, Rob, what are your thoughts on the great foreign policy thinker, Noah Smith? I think Noah Smith is a really interesting commentator. I really enjoy his like techno positivity. He is well, famously among this group, I would think, or at least a select group of the folks who are chiming in here. He blocked me on Twitter because I kept questioning his uncritical Pentagon stenography and celebration of U.S. military-industrial complex stuff. So yeah, it's frustrating because I actually enjoy that Noah Smith's Twitter personality. I enjoy a lot of his techno-optimism, and I think it actually, you know, since he blocked me, I feel like it's. I wonder if just having less of that that vibe coming in has made my work a little darker. I don't know. But I think on foreign policy, he just has no fucking idea what he's talking about. And it's really interesting because, you know, I'm still, I think, a subscriber on his Substack or something like that, and it's almost touchingly sweet and naive. He had a big piece that endorsed a lot of the things that I endorse, saying like, well, you have to understand, you know, we have to focus on. We have to focus on Ukraine, so it's time to stop worrying about Venezuela. It's time to start worrying about Iran. You know, the Biden administration has to go do these things. And it's just so funny because he just doesn't quite understand that, like, the same people he's lionizing, I think he's just constantly, was I talking about the American, no, it was on Twitter this morning. I was talking about the American Enterprise Institute, which is a sort of famous Reaganite think tank that has just got about the second worst foreign policy in Washington, D.C. After the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. Is just uber hawkish, looking to start fights with everybody, just brutally violent idiots. And Noah Smith provides a huge platform for them, whether he's interviewing them on his Substack, whether he's reposting their most insane editorials in foreign affairs, provides a huge platform for these people. And then Noah Smith will turn around and make this really sensible, obvious point that we should get back in the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, we should have always gotten back in the Iran nuclear deal. We should have always abandoned Donald Trump's absurd Venezuela policy where we pretend that they have a president that isn't the president. Obviously, we should have always done that. But Noah Smith was exactly right to point out that in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we needed to focus on getting oil sources everywhere. We have to do this. But Noah Smith can't see that the exact same people, the American Enterprise Institute and other hawks that he promotes, are exactly the same people who will make it impossible for common sense choices around the Venezuela or the Iran file. So yeah, I just think he's a little naive. I think I think his beat is more sort of economics, Silicon Valley stuff. And I think he's, you know, as with many sort of history amateurs, he's like myself. He's gotten more interested in politics in recent years and geopolitics in recent years. And he's just making very amateur, silly mistakes, as I did back in 2003. When I think, you know, it's funny, in 2003, he was right and I was wrong. He was an opponent of the Iraq War, apparently, and I am not. Let's see. Logo cool extreme. Hey, Logo, we don't need to sell people on Patreon quite that hard. We don't need to be, you know, trying to embarrass people who aren't patrons. Let's let them. People. I am tremendously grateful to everybody who joins on Patreon. I certainly want to heavily encourage people to join on Patreon. We don't need to be doing hard sells in the comments. Logan, if you wouldn't mind. Opinions on Noam Chomsky. You know, Daxton Min, thanks. I did a video on a takedown video of Noam Chomsky. I think Noam Chomsky is a national treasure. I also think, as with anybody who has been in public service, not public service, but has been in the public eye, it's extraordinary. Noam Chomsky has been in the public eye, largely saying the same things for like 60 years. which is extraordinary. He's an MIT professor who I think during the Vietnam War, relatively early in the Vietnam War, sort of in the mid 60s, decided to become a public anti-war advocate after he got tenure at MIT. And for 60 years, he has been banging the drum, sort of anti-U.S. empire drum. And I have immense respect for that. However, of course, having spent 50 years doing this, he's been wrong a couple times. He supported the Khmer Rouge, something he shares with Ronald Reagan, which is, something they don't talk about in the Ronald Reagan biographies so much. And I think that I think he's since backed off on his support for, the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s as Henry Kissinger was bombing Cambodia when Genocide Revelations came out. I think there's I attacked Kraut. This is another YouTube channel that made a Noam Chomsky takedown video a couple months back. I attacked Kraut because he's talking about Noam Chomsky like he's garbage, like he's a genocide denier. I think that's completely unfair. But I think you can make very strong arguments that Noam Chomsky's positioning on the wars in Yugoslavia is pretty kind of gross and kind of humiliating. There's a door that slammed. I think you can make a strong case for that. But that is not really, I don't think that justifies discarding or dismissing Noam Chomsky's entire extraordinary position as a public intellectual and extraordinary efforts that he's made over the past 60 years. It's just extraordinary. He's in his 90s now, and he famously will answer every email. He'll famously go on, he's to go from having, I think he famously had a very public debate with William F. Buckley on Crossfire in literally the second or third decade of television. And Noam Chomsky is like going on YouTube live streams, still at it. It's just such an extraordinary life, such an extraordinary inspiration, I think, to many people. And but of course, he's gotten a few things wrong. Jack Hawkins asks, Colombia. Oh shit! Did I miss the second? Have we gotten the second round of the Colombia election yet? Let me just. It's Sunday. Oh wow. Okay, so 2 days from now, we have the second round of the Colombia election. I have not followed any news since the first round on May 29th, Jack. Let me know if there's something important that I've missed. I think the consensus, I don't know if there's been polling since, maybe Jack or Scott here can tell me. Has there been polling in Colombia? What's interesting about Colombia is that Colombia is sort of the staunchest ally of sort of the United States in the region. Staunchest ally of the U.S. military. Colombia is, of course, famously the home of Pablo Escobar, famously had a lot to do with the sort of birth of the large-scale cocaine industry in the United States. So the United States has just poured an absolute ton of money into first a massive civil war against the peasant communist movement, and then anti-drug interdiction. So Colombia had, it's one of those, is it the only Latin American country where U.S. funding of reactionary elements dramatically escalated in the 1990s in the aftermath of the Cold War, because it was a seamless transition from anti-communist to anti-drug cartel activity. So the United States has really reliably had folks in power there for decades. I think that before the current very right-wing president, was the guy before him was a little milder, or was he actually left-wing? Regardless, if he was left-wing, he was in the context of a very center-left approach. Though he did inaugurate peace with FARC, right? Anyway, so that makes what happened on May 29th quite disturbing to the United States, which was a strongly left-wing, I'm not sure if he was a former member of FARC or some other leftist guerrilla, But regardless, a former guerrilla, still very leftist, won the first round of Colombian elections. And I think I don't think there's a question in my mind anymore. People like to talk about in the early 2000s there being a pink wave in Latin America. And there was some question in my mind up until the victory of Gabriel Boric in Chile, whether there was a new pink wave in Latin America. But after the left-wing Boric won, I think it became pretty clear that there is a new left-wing wave, I would argue prompted by Donald Trump in Latin America. And if a left, excuse me, if a left-wing guerrilla won the election in Colombia, that would be just an absolute pink typhoon, pink tsunami. I think the smart money, and I don't know enough about Colombia to dispute it, would say that this leftist guerrilla is likely to lose. I think he got 40% of the vote, and then number two was has been described as a TikTok populist, but also very right-leaning. I don't know. Is he a Trumpy figure? I think I think The Economist. You should trust him if they are anti or right-wing figure. You should never trust The Economist if they're anti-left-wing figure. But they amusingly described the two winners, the guerrilla and the TikTok populist, as two failed mayors. Is apparently what the public service history of these folks looks like. So, all right, anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. Left-wing guy won the first round of elections. Seems likely that he will lose the second round. The number two guy with 22% was this TikTok populist. There's another right-wing guy who's thrown his support behind the TikTok populist. It seems most likely that, or at least it seemed 2 weeks ago. I haven't looked into it recently, but it seemed most likely that the right-wing guy would win in Colombia. But regardless, it's a big shock to the United States that we would be at risk of losing our traditional right-wing support in Colombia. Not that that would necessarily be the case. I think it's been this new pink wave has, I think, learned the very sad, humiliating lessons of Chavez and Maduro, that if you make a big stink about how anti-imperialist and anti-the U.S. you are, you can end up screwed pretty hard. That is certainly been the experience of Venezuela. I think Gabriel Boric has been quite, the new left-wing leader of Chile, has been quite Chile-focused in his leftism. Very careful to have a pleasant and civil conversation with Biden. After being elected, he's sort of letting, what's the word I'm looking for? I have no idea what word I'm looking for. But, yeah, anyway, I think I'm cautiously optimistic about Latin America, though obviously the incredible political, economic crisis that the world is dealing with right now doesn't bode well for Latin America. But actually, the energy transition, there's a lot of commodities involved. I think Chile specifically, as someone had pointed out, they're like the Saudi Arabia for copper, and copper is very important in the coming years. So who knows? Maybe things will go well. Jack Hawkins would like me to talk about Sadr in Iraq and his faction and the faction's resignation. Muqtada Sadr is a fascinating figure, led militias against the U.S. military when we were occupying, but is now just generally seems to be against foreign occupation more generally, which is the positioning of a lot of people, and now seems to be, despite being a Shia, is he actually a Shia religious figure? Is that a fair way to describe him? I know his branding is certainly with a turban and in traditional clothing rather than showing up in suits, as a lot of Iraqi politicians do. But yeah, I believe he is to some extent a religious Shia figure. But his main positioning in over the past decade has been to be fervently against the influence of Shia Iran in Iraq. So, despite the fact that we blew up a guy who was much more tangentially related to killing U.S. soldiers, Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, Sadr is now our boy, to an extent. I don't think Sadr is anybody's boy. I think would be a good qualification to make there. He's very powerful in Iraqi politics. My understanding is that his factions did very well in the election, and he attempted to do something that we have not yet seen in Iraq. Iraq has had, I don't know, what, 4, 5, 6 elections at this point, maybe even more. But because, almost in a somewhat Lebanon-like, in a developing Lebanon-like situation, which you definitely don't want to be Lebanon, they've had sort of a sectarian organization, not as set in stone. I think to some degree, it's actually, is it constitutional in Lebanon? The fact that certain offices are parceled out to certain ethnicities or to certain religious sects. Iraq, like Lebanon, has a very strong sectarian nature. And in every election since the U.S. invasion back in 2003, the results have been very similar. Some kind of grand coalition has taken over Iraq. And this, in practice, hasn't worked out very well. It's not really politics. It's just the parliamentary elections sort of seem sort of like a rough guide towards how power may be distributed to some degree, but some variety of a sort of strong cross-sectarian grand coalition has run Iraq ever since Iraq took power back, I don't know, 2005 or so from the U.S. occupation, to the extent that it did. And I think the consensus among the Iraqi public would be that it's been a cataclysmic failure, these grand coalitions. They just simply haven't delivered. I don't know if it's still that bad today, but I wouldn't be surprised that, electricity provision is still worse than it was in Saddam Hussein's period, stuff like that. So what Sadr attempted to do, Muqtada al-Sadr attempted to do in the aftermath of, I guess this was already last fall, right? The Iraqi elections, where he did well enough, is he proposed forming a coalition with some other factions, I believe with Sunni and Kurdish factions that had done well enough, and actually creating, instead of a grand coalition, still a cross-sectarian coalition, but one that actually kicked out the Shia losers, that actually had a functioning government and an opposition. So to actually, really, to take, it's very interesting that Muqtada al-Sadr, throughout the aughts, like a huge boogeyman for the United States. We certainly tried to kill him. Interesting that he's the guy pushing Iraq towards a more functioning sort of Western-style parliamentary democracy. The pro-Iranian Shia factions that would be kicked out of power by this have obviously opposed this. And I think the most recent thing is that after refusing to let him form a government, which he should have been able to form due to the results of the election, I believe Sadr has to some extent thrown up his hands and called for a new election or something along those lines. But I just don't know. I don't know enough about that. But it is fascinating watching developments in Iraq, and I should probably pay more attention. Okay. Logo Cool Extreme says, it makes me sad whenever anyone mentions Lebanon. I feel similarly. It is a place that is in a lot of trouble. And the sad thing is, with a lot of places that are in a lot of trouble, with ongoing wars, ongoing instability, you can sort of see a way out. You can say, oh, well, if this and this and this happens, things will get better. And we've actually seen that in recent years. Libya, a country that was just sort of a nonstop disaster, at least from 2014 until 2020, actually got a real peace process in 2021. And while it's not going as well as one might perhaps hope. It's still going. Yemen, something we focus on a lot, is now in month 3 of a ceasefire. So there is positive progress possible in these places. Not so much in Lebanon. It's really hard to see what the positive possibilities are. Let's see. Wow, Impaler says, what holds Brazil back from becoming a superpower is racism. Since the end of the empire, the agricultural elite that rules the country, like Wall Street, don't want a black or mixed race people getting power. Wow, okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a fond tradition of Brazilians talking about how post-racial and how much better they are with race relations than the United States, and then Afro-Brazilians being like, excuse me? Yeah, I can't speak too much I have not made a huge study of Brazil, but my understanding is that, it's interesting when people talk about the Gilded Age in the United States and how out of control income inequality is becoming. One of the standard ways to emphasize how bad it's getting is inequality here is getting almost as bad as Brazil, which indicates that perhaps. Local Extreme says it's depressing how I'm more optimistic for Sri Lanka than I am for Lebanon. It's not surprising though. Sri Lanka is in a terrible, terrible state. And don't get me wrong, Sri Lanka, they fought a huge civil war against the Tamils, and apparently also have a really bad history with a small Muslim minority there as well. But it is what's the word I'm looking for? It's a political system where change is possible. Because Lebanon's, again, I'm embarrassed, I can't remember whether it's in the Constitution or if it's sort of an extra constitutional agreement that has sort of survived since independence from France in the 40s. Because in the name of fairness, Lebanon has had this system where, every sect gets its allotted slice of the government. Real change and real improvement has simply not been possible. In Sri Lanka, if they can just ditch the Rajapaksas, renegotiate some debt. To be clear, Sri Lanka's got a huge hill to climb, but it's a hill that's climbable. Lebanon, as long as it holds on to its current system, and as long as the U.S. keeps brutalizing Syria, as long as that's the case, Lebanon doesn't have a hill to climb. It has a wall of barbed wire that it can't even imagine getting over. Let's see. Questions. Do we have questions? What do I think about the Iran new tunnels? I don't know what the Iran new tunnels are. Fadel says, Sadr has not called for new elections, but he is shaping an environment where new elections will be necessary. But so he can blame it on the coordination framework and increase his parliament share. Okay, so Sadr has not called for new elections, but he is shaping the political environment to a point where new elections may be necessary, so that Sadr can blame it on the coordination framework. The coordination framework is the political machine that I think it's largely Shia and fair to characterize it as in service to Iran. Is that fair? It's interesting because I'm a very pro-Iran guy in terms of broader geopolitics, but I am entirely sympathetic with Sadr. I'm entirely sympathetic with anybody who wants to get foreign influence out of their country. Yeah. So in Iraqi politics, I'm very anti. I'm very anti-Iran. Whereas in broader geopolitics, I wish the U.S. would just leave Iran alone. What's after the Reagan era? That's a great question, Johannes Awake. What is after the Reagan era? That's, I think Biden had a chance to be a definitional figure. Trump had a chance to be a definitional figure, and both failed. So who knows? How many Euro politicians are biting their hands over the CFE treaty right now? The CFE treaty. What's the CFE treaty, Malta? You'll have to remind me, I'm afraid. Local Extreme. Thoughts on the BJP suspending a member for making offensive remarks on the Prophet Muhammad, and how the BJP had harsher penalties than Republicans had to January 6th. I mean, were the BJP penalties really that harsh? I think they kicked them out of the party or something. I mean, okay. Um, and was MTG, I haven't been following it. Has MTG been shown to be somehow especially responsible for the January 6th thing? Wasn't it? It was Lauren Boebert and some other hee-haw who were showing folks around the Congress the day before, right? Was MTG one of them? I don't know. Man, I don't even know how to begin to talk about India, what's going on in India at this point. I had a short that I think was probably a bit inelegant talking about this. I had a broader point that I wanted to make talking about how things are getting harsher for Muslims in India. I do think that this particular example, where the BJP, I think mostly because of pressure from Muslim countries, reacted appropriately or even overreacted to some anti-Islam comments from members of their polity. That is not a good illustration of the fact that more generally things are getting worse for Muslims in India. And it's also something I need to research a bit more. Got a video from like 2 years ago talking about how bad things were for Muslims in Kashmir and Assam, and I haven't followed up on those situations in the slightest. India, it's like a whole country, man. I feel bad because I told Loga before the break that I was going to try to bone up on India and try to do some videos on India and Pakistan, and I am not very close to that. Local Extreme says she was suspended from the party and there's currently a criminal investigation against her. While MTG actually sent the January 6th goons Pelosi's location. You know, I did not know that. I just don't follow the January 6th thing very much. Does that make me a bad anti-Trumper? I know that January 6th is appalling. I know that it is something that happened. And like, I just think there's a million things we should be focusing on. Like, the answer to January 6th is to making sure that Republicans don't get back into power. And I think focusing on January 6th, as much as we have been, does nothing to stop that. Stop Republicans getting back into power. So, you know, I mean, I'm glad that, like, you know, there's hearings and everything. They should have been done the day after, not 18 months after. So, yeah, I just don't think I think what's more important at this point is how does Biden convince anybody to vote Democratic in the current economic and geopolitical context. And I don't know if January 6th really helps in that endeavor. So. Both USA and Saudi Arabia are highly corrupt countries' regimes, especially USA with its fake democracy. You want democracy? Look in Europe, Japan, Australia. No, hey man, like, Donald Trump got elected. Like, if we didn't have, you know, somewhat real democracy in the United States, Donald Trump would not have gotten elected. And yes, he was not elected by the majority. He was, it's because our screwed up system is very screwed up that he was able to take power. Sorry, it's very out of it, losing track. Because of it, that he was able to take power. But like, if we really had a fake democracy where only the elites gained power, Donald Trump would not have spent 4 years as president. I believe that the people in power, the true elites, the folks who are really in charge, were very clear in not wanting Donald Trump to be U.S. president, and remain humiliated that it happened to this day. We do have real democracy in the United States. It just definitely needs to work better. All right, guys, I'm sorry. I am fading very hardcore. I think I'm going to maybe call it a day now. I am a bit ill. Well, let's see now. Make it to 1:40. That's a good. Try and do another 6 minutes. Are we spending too much supporting Ukraine? You know, this is something I really want to do a deeper dive on. My concern. Are we spending too much? I don't know about that. Because there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. Like, I think that supporting Ukraine's independence from Russia is a supremely worthwhile thing for U.S. foreign policy, arguably the most worthwhile thing we've had in U.S. foreign policy in 30 years. I think it's a great thing to do. Did it need to be $40 billion? So it's weird. We have this mismatch where we've given them $40 billion over the past 4 months. Yet Ukraine is somehow still short of basic weaponry that it needs to fight off the Russians. And my concern, I haven't done the research on this yet. My concern is that we are working with a defense industry that never had to do anything serious. For the past 30 years, it's been about spending money for blowing up, dudes in caves. Like, it has not been nothing about the war on terror, nothing about the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan were at all serious business from a military standpoint. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Americans were dying, Americans were working very hard or what have you, but there was nothing serious about those endeavors. Defending Ukraine from Russia is a serious military endeavor. It is something that requires extreme amounts of material, competent use of intelligence, and we haven't done any of that for the past 30 years. It's just been a joke where, the Pentagon asks for money and the Congress tries to find out how to give them more money, to really just waste on anything. It's been just a sort of a silly dance. Again, with folks on the ground who've worked very hard and have sadly been very dedicated to not much of worth. But it hasn't been a serious thing. And my real concern is that, do we have a military-industrial complex that is capable of maintaining and sustaining a real war? Because the Ukraine-Russia war is a real war, nowhere near, that is, on a much bigger, much more serious, much more logistically complex, materially intense than anything we did in the sort of war on terror wankfest over the past 30 years. So, yeah, we spent $40 billion, and I'm sure that there's a lot of companies that are in the United States that are $38 billion richer. How much actual money is getting to Ukraine? How much of the actual material and logistical support they need are they getting? That's, I think, a much more interesting question. And I think in just the publicly available breakdown of how that $40 billion is spent should give an indication of what's going on, what the real potentials are there. So anyway, yeah, I'm fading, folks. But thank you so much for being here. Y'all are the best. Yeah, I gotta go. Those are all big and interesting questions. I'm sorry to duck out 20 minutes later, but I am stopping making sense. So I think I've got to call it. You guys are great. And yes, everybody should sign up for Patreon. Cool. Oh, Jesus. Mujahid. I do appreciate Mujahid's extreme commitment to Al-Qaeda ideology circa 2001. It's a true triumph of hope over experience. All right, folks. See ya.